It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. On this day after Thanksgiving, sort of holiday they call Black Friday, my team is off too, so we have put together some favorite recent segments, lightly polished up, including an experiment in trying to live without AI. Climate activist Bill McKibben, the legendary climate activist Bill McKibben, on his life and times. We will ask, can we become better people? And we start here with a fresh look at the U.S. Constitution. And of course, we can't take your calls today, but we hope you enjoy listening, maybe re-listening to these favorites. Back with us now, Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer Jill Lepore. Her new book is called We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Part of it is a history of the original document and the many successful and unsuccessful attempts to amend it. Part of the book is an argument to make the Constitution easier to amend. I will definitely ask if that's a good idea per her values in today's polarized country. But interestingly, one of Professor Lepore's roles is director of Harvard's Amendment Project, which says it aims to compile, classify, and analyze every significant attempt to revise the Constitution since 1787. Jill Lepore was last here for her 2023 book, These Truths, A History of the United States. Jill, we always appreciate when you come on with us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. Great to be here.
So after writing your ambitious history of the United States as a whole, why a history of the Constitution in particular?
I had a really fun time writing the history of the United States that I tried to pull together in These Truths, and a lot of readers wrote to me and said how much they valued the constitutional history in that book. They hadn't found that in other U.S. history books. And so I thought it would be really interesting to try to pull together an account of the history of the U.S. Constitution. Though I actually kind of want to quibble at the start, Brian, with the idea that the book is an argument for making the Constitution easier to amend. I'm kind of fascinated by that characterization. I'm a historian. I'm not a policymaker or a policy proposer or even a political pundit. So the book doesn't make such a recommendation. I don't have a list of amendments that I propose in the book. It is a reflection on the extended history of the difficulty of amending the U.S. Constitution in distinction to the state constitutions, which are in general quite easy to amend. So I take stock of what it might mean that it has been difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution, but I don't have a policy brief. I just don't. Right. I don't have one.
Well, maybe I was overinterpreting what I saw as an implication from some of the history in the book about how difficult it's become over time and how reluctant both Democrats and Republicans have become to try to push for constitutional amendments. And we'll get into some of that. But since you mentioned the states, since your book does touch on state constitutions, it got me curious to look up how many times some state constitutions have been amended. We know the U.S. Constitution has been amended 27 times. I looked up the kind of politically diverse or maybe opposite states, sort of New York and Mississippi. Ballotpedia says New York's Constitution has been amended at least 207 times, 20 of them just since 1996. Mississippi's 123 times, so it's a lot in both cases compared to 27 for the U.S. Constitution. And, I didn't look deeper to analyze whether the amendments go in opposite left-right directions, but I have a guess. But do those raw numbers say something about state versus federal constitutionalism?
Yeah, there is a very big contrast. So although the U.S. Constitution, we've ratified 27 amendments, about 12,000 have been introduced on the floor of Congress. And it's a little bit difficult to count in the states, but if you look across all the states, something in the order of 12,000 amendments have been proposed to state constitutions, of which about 8,000 have been ratified. So for a kind of 75% success rate in the states. So if something gets proposed in the states, it has a much easier path to ratification. And, a lot of legal scholars would say, well, the state constitutions are a mess, and people are actually putting in constitutions what are really just ordinary statutes that don't belong in constitutions. So there's a very active debate about what is a good amendment rate, but the U.S. Constitution, compared to other national constitutions, has one of the lowest amendment rates, whereas American states, that amendment rate, something on the order of 75%, is kind of common across national. The U.S. states look a lot like national constitutions in that way. And also the U.S. states, most of our states have replaced their constitutions, not just amended them.
You write that the U.S. Constitution rests on three 18th century beliefs. The first is that the Constitution is a machine. What do you mean by the Constitution is a machine?
The framers of the Constitution were very much living in the shadow, or maybe in the bright light, we might say, of Newtonian physics, right? This sort of incredible intellectual revolution that we think of as the scientific revolution of the 17th century, or a set of ideas kind of we think of as mechanical philosophy, that the discovery of the law of gravity led to a really kind of deep-seated belief that all of the natural world could be understood in relationship to physical laws, as if the world itself were a giant machine. People sometimes talked about it as a giant clockworks that had been set in motion by a creator, right, by God. And the framers of the Constitution applied this idea of mechanical philosophy to politics itself. So Alexander Hamilton talked about the new science of politics, that what distinguished the moderns, that is the 18th century political philosophers, from the ancients was this idea that even the act of government could be analyzed and reduced to forces that could be kept in check like the gears of a machine. So when we talk about checks and balances in constitutions or the separation of powers, these, for the framers, were really somewhat more than a metaphor of thinking of the Constitution as a mechanism, right? Very precisely. And this is, among the reasons the U.S. Constitution has not been amended, right? Like if you have this perfectly designed clockworks, where one force holds in abeyance another force, and when you wind something up, it engages an engine, then you kind of don't want to tinker with it. So in that sense, they really did understand constitutions as machinery.
Right. But the other two 18th century beliefs that you cite there, which I guess are related, are that the human mind is driven by reason and history moves in the direction of progress. I'll ask you in a minute if the 21st century, if you think the founders of the Constitution, I realize you said you're not a pundit, but I'll at least ask if you think that the founders would still think that the human mind is driven by reason and history moves in the direction of progress. But what was the 18th century, the 1700s context of those? Because if they believed in progress, then one would think that they would be open to amendment, not to have a static document that was written in 1787 or so.
Right. Progress is the watchword of the 18th century. And it's a different word than we use today when we talk about progress. I think most people, when they use the term progress, they're actually thinking about technological progress. I would think that's especially true with younger people, right? That when you talk about progress or change over time, people are like, well, which version of the iPhone did I have? Or is this before or after Twitter, or before or after the internet, right? Like, we tend to index change by technological progress, and that's right. How we tend to think about it.
Think of Martin Luther King, the arc of history bends towards justice, right?
Yeah, so that notion of moral progress, that is the way that people in the 18th century used the term progress or thought about progress. And so they thought of the revolution, the American Revolution, and later the French Revolution, although they were very ambivalent about the French Revolution, as the great English radical Richard Price said, a great amendment in human affairs, that the end of monarchy, the throwing off of monarchy, and the devising of written constitutions that guaranteed rights and allowed for the consent of the governed and declared the equality of all people, marked this great amendment in the history of human affairs, a complete break with the past. So Paine said, we begin the world anew with the American Revolution. But they understood, though, that this isn't like a one-time thing. They very much believed in really the incrementalism of the findings of the scientific revolution, right? Like there are big ideas like the Copernican revolution or the Newtonian revolution, and then there are findings and adjustments and changes. And so for the framers of the US Constitution, they borrowed an idea that they got from the state constitutions, which was that there should be a fairly generous provision for amending the Constitution. They were also, remember, they had gathered in Philadelphia in this hot summer of 1787 in order to revise the existing frame of government for the Union of the 13 states, which was the Articles of Confederation, which were amendable, but only by the unanimous consent of all 13 states, which meant that people kept proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation and they could never achieve them. It was just like too high of a bar. So they knew that they needed to have an amendment provision, and they wanted it not to be too easy, because they were trying to write down a constitution in order to provide stability across time, right, across generations. They wanted this constitution to be durable, but they didn't want it to be too hard, because if you don't have a way to make corrections, improvements, repairs to a written constitution, then the only way to change the government in any fundamental sense is insurrection. And they had just been through a terrible, horrible war. So they were trying to come up with a peaceful means of changing the frame of government. So I do think that this commitment to political progress, legal progress, but also moral progress, because the word amendment has a real moral meaning to it in the 18th century, is foundational to American constitutionalism. They did not expect that it would become so difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution, nor that it would become so easy to amend the state constitutions. Right? They didn't know how are they to know what to expect. But I think I think we have kind of forgotten how foundational this principle, this philosophy of amendment, was to the founding of the United States.
So those 18th century beliefs, the human mind is driven by reason and history moves in the direction of progress. Do you ever wonder, as a historian, or speculate if the framers were alive today, maybe they would think the human mind is driven more by passions and history just rotates between progress and reaction?
So, I've yet to meet a historian who imagines what people from the past would think of today, in the sense that people from the past are actually rooted in the past. Their entire worldview is a product of the period in which they live. So I just you can't extract, Benjamin Franklin once said, he really wished that he could be preserved in a vat of Madeira wine because he wanted to see what the country was going to be like in 100 years. People in the past are interested in what life would be like in the future. But we can't you can't just kind of pull somebody out of a jigsaw puzzle and put them in your own jigsaw puzzle. It's a piece from a different puzzle. It doesn't really fit. So and that very question, it's actually really interesting, this sort of what would the framers do? You actually see that emerging in American kind of popular culture. After this book is published by one of the founders of fundamentalism, What Would Jesus Do? This is in the 1890s, right, when fundamentalism, the religious movement, is being founded in the United States in opposition to Darwinism, right? And then it extends to buttress what emerges in that era, which is kind of the first modern form of constitutional conservatism, where constitutional conservatives during the progressive era keep asking, what would the founders do? This is when they coined the phrase the founding fathers, right? They sort of begin to deify and worship the drafters of the Constitution. And so that very move, it's very interesting, what would the founders do, is a kind of constitutional fundamentalism that itself has a quite interesting particular political history. And it's been a very big part of, say, the Tea Party movement. It's of course the logic to some degree behind the mode of constitutional interpretation that's prevalent on the Supreme Court, that's known as originalism, that we should always be asking, what would James Madison say? Oh, could you bring an AR-15 to an elementary school? What would James Madison say? Even that very question So I don't mean to litigate the question, Brian, because it is an interesting question, but like to even engage in the logic of that question is to choose a mode of understanding constitutionalism that's not the one that, frankly, the founders subscribed to.
It's really fascinating for me, and I'm sure for the listeners, to hear you, as the historian that you are, reflect on that question that many people probably speculate, and I dared to ask out loud, what might the framers think about one thing or another. If you're just joining us, my guest is Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer Jill Lepore. Her new book is called We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. You know, you mentioned the Tea Party, and I was interested in that section of your book where you note that the Tea Party movement sprung up in 2009, right after President Obama was elected, with the motto, "The Constitution means what it says." But then, as you also note, they wanted a constitutional convention. So how do you understand the Tea Party at once digging in on the Constitution, quote, as it is, means what it says, and wanting to throw it open for a rewrite?
Well, holding a convention is entirely constitutional, so I don't think those two things are necessary. I take your point, but I don't think the two things are necessarily in conflict. You know, what sort of has happened over the course of American history is the Constitution is changing all the time, right? I think, I'm sure you've had many shows about constitutional change, right? A Supreme Court decision comes down. We think about the Dobbs decision overturning Roe, or Obergefell in 2015 constitutionalizing, protecting same-sex marriage under the protections of the 14th Amendment, right? The Constitution is changing all the time. At the moment, it's being changed in this very odd way in which, you know, the President of the United States in the office of the executive declares that, for instance, you know, birthright citizenship is not in the Constitution, and as if by fiat that is so. It always reminds me of Captain Picard, make it so. You know, that's completely unconstitutional, right? There is no role for the president in interpreting the Constitution in such a way, or in offering, he can say whatever he wants, but it doesn't make it so. So there is constitutional change happening all the time. The way that constitutional change is written into the Constitution and provided for is through Article 5 of the Constitution, which provides for formal constitutional amendment, either by an amendment being passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification, or by the states calling for a constitutional convention to propose amendments that then go back to the states for ratification. Those are the two things we never do. We've never had the convention, and we don't very often do the amending. But we nevertheless change the constitutional. Like, it's going to happen. There are adjustments required. And there's been this kind of odd push me, pull me in constitutional history, in that there are flurries. There are moments when, what George Washington called the constitutional door is opened, and suddenly, like, a slew of amendments get ratified. Like the Civil War and Reconstruction amendments that are so important to our constitutional order. And then the door shuts, and then it takes decades for another series of amendments to even be publicly discussed. But in the periods between these little flurries of amendments, the court is determining what the Constitution means. And because the court changes its mind, not often, I mean, the court attempts to not frivolously change its mind, but the court does change its mind on what the Constitution means. And that is the way that our Constitution most often changes, which, because that's a longstanding practice, but it's not in the design. If you think about that mechanism, right, like then everything, then the clock's a little out of kilt. Like it's, we're losing 5 seconds a day. Eventually you lose a year, so every time the Constitution changes by way of Supreme Court interpretation, the balance of power between the three branches of governments, the way that the people are supposed to check, have a checking power, that no longer really exists. So we have really, since, you probably remember time before Supreme Court appointments were like so newsy, so controversial, everybody was fixated on them. It's really not. It's only since about 1987 with Robert Bork's nomination by Ronald Reagan that pressure on the court has been, on these Supreme Court nominations, has been such a matter of public contestation. And that's because so much is at stake, given that the Supreme Court is the only currently operating mechanism for changing the Constitution.
Oh, that's so interesting as a reason why it's become so political every time there's a Supreme Court nomination. But even looking further back, your section on basically the whole 1800s, 1803 to 1896, is called The Contest Over Interpretation, beginning with a chapter called Let's Examine the Word White. So were there constitutional battles before or after the Civil War over interpreting the word white, or what were the battles over interpretation in the 1800s, if not via the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it's a really dynamic period. The sort of contest in the 1800s is over who gets to decide what the Constitution means and how to amend it. And kind of pretty quickly it becomes clear that Article 5 isn't going to work. That mechanism, right, was like that sort of try to have that Goldilocks bar, like not too hard to amend, but not too easy. It seemed like a pretty rational compromise, I'm sure, in 1787, but that was before political parties existed in the United States. So by 1800, there are political parties. Suddenly, it's really hard to get a 2/3 vote for anything in Congress, right? Then there's the sectional divide that existed in 1787 gets much more severe, right? As the southern slave states really dig in on defending the institution of slavery by the 1830s. The northern states are now all free states. They're really opposed to slavery. So, like, how are you going to get to the 2/3 bar if you have political parties and you have sectional divisions?
And just so people know the numbers, to amend the Constitution, because I don't think we said it out loud, it takes 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the states. Is that accurate?
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, you think about that, that gets you, it's decades of no one can propose an amendment that deals with slavery. You can't even read it after 1833, you can't even read out loud. Because of a gag rule that's imposed by the Southern slave power, you can't even read out loud a petition opposing slavery on the floor of Congress. Like, there's no way that slavery can be defeated by constitutional amendment in that period. Because of these forces that the framers didn't intend. So you go from 1803 to 1865 without any constitutional amendments. That's not to say there's not a lot of constitutional contestation, because, of course, one of the things that's happening is abolitionists who early in this period really denounce the Constitution. William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, famously burns the Constitution. He calls it a covenant with death, an agreement with hell. He says it sanctions slavery. But then Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist, breaks with Garrison and says, you know what? No, let's just say the Constitution does not sanction slavery. Let us defend the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. And abolitionists, really led by black abolitionists, what they do in these years is they essentially constitutionalize the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? They take that language, that we are created equal, and essentially make it a part of the Constitution. And on the back of that argument, they defend the Constitution. So now there's two competing constitutions. And the first thing the southern states do when they secede and form the Confederacy is they write a new constitution. There is a Confederate constitution that says slavery is allowed within this Constitution. So we could think of, at the federal level, all the constitutional contestation being over who gets to decide. Is slavery allowed or not allowed under the terms of this Constitution? And there are a lot of players in that debate. It's not just members of Congress duking it out. It is also the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of black men who meet in effectively constitutional conventions all across the free states, starting in I think 1829. They hold more than 200 of these black conventions that are sort of like de facto constitutional conventions, where they're making arguments, offering constitutional interpretations, at the same time that the states are holding their own constitutional conventions. Another like 200 constitutional conventions going on in the states, where only white men are participating. And what the states are generally doing in those years are dropping property qualifications for voting. So it used to be you had to be a taxpayer, own a certain amount of real estate or a certain amount of cash in order to vote. But because of the democratization of American society, the states are dropping those property requirements. And once they do that, that means that black men could vote. Black men tend to be very poor, and they were generally, although in some places, eligible to vote before this. In this period, free black men are likely to be enfranchised. They're going to be enfranchised if property qualifications are dropped. So a big thing the states are involved in doing is introducing the word white as a qualification for voting in the states, which is partly what the black conventions are all about. These are people organizing around trying to defeat the introduction of the word white into state constitutions. In the same way that later suffragists would have to work after the 15th Amendment introduces the word male into the Constitution, it takes suffragists, as they say, 50 years to get the word male out of the Constitution. So there is this just whole world of constitutional agitation and struggle, interpretation, that I think we tend to leave out of U.S. constitutional history because we're really focused on the court. And the court is immensely important. I don't mean to gainsay that, but back to your question, why did I want to write this book? I just think it's actually really useful to realize that people were fighting over the meaning of the Constitution and over who had the authority to decide what the Constitution means. And that's been the case all through American history.
Jill Lepore, Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer, with us on her new book, We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. And David in Omaha, you're on WNYC with Jill Lepore. Hi, David.
Hi. I would like to add that although I don't disagree with the Founding Fathers looking at a mechanistic development of the Constitution using Newtonian physics, these men were extremely well educated in the Latin and Greek Catholic classics and the Bible, and they recognized the basic weakness of human nature. And with that, they were, unlike maybe a lot of people say, worried about it becoming a monarchy again, and as we would maybe put these days, an authoritarian government. Now, back in the day, Congress held the maximum power, and I think that our Congress has given up its prerogative to make the laws, largely because, in a way, we have too much democracy. If a congressman doesn't want to get primaried, he has to go to the most extreme positions, either on the right or the left.
David, thank you. I'm going to leave it there. And Jill, there's a lot in there, but maybe you want to comment on his take on the framers, reflecting, on something you had said earlier.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case, right? If men were angels, we would need no governments. Right? They have a very dark view of human nature. They have an especially dark view of what Hamilton referred to as an excess of democracy. So, I mean, this is how we end up with, for instance, the Electoral College, because, they get to the point of, well, how are we going to elect the president? And someone says, well, what if we just had the people elect the president? And it was like, no, it's the last thing we can possibly do. And there are reasons for that, right? They were like, don't think anybody could possibly know anyone outside of their own state, right? It takes weeks to travel. So how are people going to know a national candidate? So the next proposal is, well, let's have Congress elect the president. Well, we can't do that. That violates our separation of powers, and our clock will be out of whack. So they come up with this other idea, and a lot of the mechanisms that are in the Constitution, which we would now call aristocratic provisions, like, for instance, that the state legislatures elected members of the Senate. The people didn't elect the Senate before the 17th Amendment. These aristocratic provisions were designed to essentially filter the popular will, because, exactly as the caller says, of the real and very informed fear of demagoguery and of the possibility that a demagogue could influence ordinary voters and seize power, and even seize unlimited power. That the checks that we have in the Constitution are meant to avert that. I would say, though, that this does tie the caller's question. I didn't go there, but this question does tie to the difficulty of amendment. So, a lot of the states had very aristocratic provisions as well. Especially the 13 original states, they had, not all of them, but some of them had, the legislatures that elected the governor, right? They had very aristocratic provisions. And in the constitutional revolutions, the democratizing constitutional revolutions of the 19th century, most of the states amended out all their aristocratic provisions. And so some of them, for instance, added things like term limits for their legislators because those were considered more democratic, right? That's the kind of thing that you can't do, although people have tried and tried and tried, to the U.S. Constitution, do something like imposing term limits because of the nature of the amendment mechanism. So I absolutely agree with the caller about the fecklessness of Congress and its general impotence. Many people have observed that it's one of the many dysfunctions of our federal government right now. I think it is worth reflection that among the possible remedies for those dysfunctions not available to the people is amending the Constitution right now.
We have about 10 more minutes with Jill Lepore on her book, We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. We will bring it more into the 20th and the 21st century. Stay with us. On WNYC as we continue with Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer Jill Lepore, her new book, We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Moving into the 20th century, I think your timeline is that first the Democrats, beginning with FDR in the 1930s, and then the Republicans came to de-emphasize amending the Constitution even more. I mean, you were just talking about how hard it was from the beginning of our country. But each of the parties in the 20th century chose instead to work more with the Supreme Court to interpret or influence the Constitution. Is there a moment or a reason when you can say that the emphasis started and why?
Yeah, well, there's a big rush of amendments in the progressive era. There are 4 amendments ratified between 1913 and 1920. They're all progressive amendments. The court is really conservative at that time. So progressivism and conservatism in that era don't map onto the party system, right? There are conservative Democrats and progressive Republicans. So this is new in American history, that's what our polarization is, right? So there's this big, people are like, oh, we're amending the Constitution. Also, we have this court, they're kind of checking one another in a certain kind of balance. And then that begins to fall apart. In 1924, Congress passes a new amendment, the Child Labor Amendment, granting Congress the power to regulate the labor of children and therefore prohibit it, which the Supreme Court had said the Constitution does not grant. So this was a way to overturn a Supreme Court ruling. And there's a huge movement arrayed by really the owners of Southern textile mills to defeat the Child Labor Amendment because they want to keep employing very young children, especially young black children, in their textile mills. So they're really successful. So in the 1930s, when FDR is confronting the still conservative Supreme Court, which is beginning to strike down the New Deal, people say, oh, well, we should just constitutionalize the New Deal. Let's go get some of these things ratified in the form of constitutional amendments. But FDR looks at the Child Labor Amendment now. It's been 10 years, 12 years since it passed Congress, and it's going nowhere. And Eleanor Roosevelt had been really involved in the Child Labor Amendment. So FDR's like, we're just not going to, you only need $1 million to defeat a constitutional amendment in this country at this point. Okay, that seems like not a lot of money, but it was a lot of money in the Depression. And so he just decided to sort of brazen his way through the court, essentially bully the court. This is where the court packing plan comes from, when FDR proposes to just add justices to the court. Like, he's going to get his constitutional agenda by hook or by crook. And ever since that time, there have been some amendments ratified since then, but the way, much of the last 100 years has really involved both sides going to the court as the mechanism of constitutional change, whether that means trying to get people on the court who will make those decisions or offering up new arguments to the court. It generally means both of those things, but that has really changed the role of the court in our constitutional arrangements.
You have a chart in the book, Amendments Pledged on Party Platforms, 1984 to 2024. Party platforms, of course, being what each party adopts in the presidential election years. There are 44 of them between 1984 and 2024, though they keep recurring. And along partisan lines, the Republicans keep proposing right-to-life amendments, balanced budget, parents' rights, banning flag desecration. The Democrats keep proposing campaign finance reform. I guess that's to counter Citizens United, the Equal Rights Amendment. But I don't know that any of those 44 party platform constitutional amendment planks in the last 40 years have gotten through. Is it zero?
Oh, it's zero. And really, they're just political theater. But I mean, the big dynamic of the last few decades is really that social and fiscal conservatives were very critical of the court enacting constitutional change under the Warren Court in the 50s and 60s. And they kept proposing constitutional amendments to overturn decisions of the Warren Court, insisting that Article 5 was the only way to change the court, that Supreme Court decisions are not allowed to change the meaning of or reinterpret the Constitution. And they couldn't get any of those fiscal, mainly the Right to Life Amendment and the Balanced Budget Amendment, kind of a social and fiscal conservative amendment. And they found out, as like FDR had found out, that the amendment mechanism no longer works. And so then they created originalism, and in the Reagan years began filling the court with jurists who subscribed to this new constitutional judicial philosophy and enacting the constitutional change that they sought by way of judicial appointments instead of by way of Article 5 amendment.
You do have Reagan as among the more interested among contemporary presidents in trying to amend the Constitution. And I'm just curious if that connects at all with the quote at the very start of the book that the Constitution is intended to be amended. And it comes from the great constitutional scholar Bugs Bunny, speaking in 1986 during Reagan to leading intellectual Daffy Duck. So I guess there was an actual cartoon in 1986. Did it reflect something about the Reagan era, or is that just a coincidence?
Well, remember Schoolhouse Rock? That was during the bicentennial of the Revolution in 1975, 1976. And Looney Tunes tried to do something for the bicentennial of the Constitution, which is 1987. So that's where you get the Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck. It's actually just a great video. It didn't really take off the way Schoolhouse Rock did. But yeah, I argue that moment, the bicentennial of the Constitution, is really, really important because it's what launches originalism into the public mind through the Bork hearings in 1987, which are taking place even as you can't go into a gas station without being handed a copy of the Constitution because it's the bicentennial. Your kids can't turn on TV without Bugs Bunny lecturing them about the Constitution. That is actually a really important inflection point in the history of the Constitution.
We've just got about a minute left. Here's a comment from a listener who writes, I do not want a constitutional convention. Ever since the ERA amendment failed, I do not believe that amendments presented to the electorate are understood. I think that the right-wing propaganda machine influences a minority of voters that are party regulars and are more likely to vote than other eligible voters. And it goes to something I suggested in the intro to the segment that you chastised me for. But would you say anything about whether, wouldn't progressives have more to fear today from a constitutional convention, or if it were easier to amend the Constitution in this political climate?
That is absolutely what progressives believe. I think the caller has a really good point. And I wasn't chastising you, Brian. I just want to be clarify my own views. I think that the issue that I wanted to raise in thinking about the inability to amend the Constitution in whatever fashion is it creates all kinds of problems to hold a constitutional convention. Constitutional amendments really have no future except by constitutional convention right now, which also I don't think has any future. And that's as may be, but I do think it's worth figuring out how did we get here and what is lost in abandoning the very idea that the people have any kind of authorship in the Constitution.
Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer Jill Lepore, her new book is called We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Thank you for the book, and thank you for this conversation.
Thanks so much.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, much more to come. It's a Best of Brian Lehrer show on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and this next segment is a guaranteed AI-free zone. Probably. When author and essayist A.J. Jacobs decided to live 48 hours without artificial intelligence, no ChatGPT, no algorithms, not even the facial recognition feature on his phone, he thought it would be simple. Then he realized he couldn't check the weather, ride the subway, even brush his teeth without bumping into some kind of machine learning. Now, Jacobs, who some of you know from his past appearances on this show and other things, who's made a career out of turning himself into a human experiment, living biblically for a year, remember that book? Reading the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, even following the Constitution's original meaning, quote unquote, set out to see how much of his everyday life in this experiment was quietly run by AI. The answer, just about all of it. He wrote about it in the New York Times under the headline 48 Hours Without AI, a funny, revealing chronicle of how hard it is to escape the algorithmic web we all live in. So we'll talk about what he learned, what he wore, what he ate, and what his 2 days without AI say about the future of being human. Even with us now is A.J. Jacobs, host of the Hello Puzzlers podcast, essayist, author of The Year of Living Biblically, The Know-It-All, It's All Relative, in which he proved that he and I are very, very distant cousins, and his latest, The Year of Living Constitutionally, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Constitution's Original Meaning. Always great to have you, AJ. Hi, welcome back to WNYC.
Delighted to be here, Brian, and also very happy to hear it's AI-free. I was a little worried I might be talking to an AI-generated Brian Lehrer, but I'm now assured you're the real thing.
Well, I'm not an AI-generated Brian Lehrer, but I said it's probably an AI-free segment because of what you experienced. You don't even know what AI is actually influencing in your daily interaction. So when was the moment you realized that this would be harder than you expected?
Well, the origin story is that the article is sort of a sequel to an article I wrote for the New York Times 2 years ago, where I tried to avoid interacting with plastic. So no using plastic products or even touching plastic, which turned out to be incredibly hard because it's everywhere in our clothes, our carpets, our food, and we need to address that. But a couple of months ago, my editor at the Times, the great Jim Windolf, had the idea, what about a sequel instead of plastic, AI? Because his theory, which turned out to be true, is that AI is, as you say, everywhere. It's sort of hiding in plain sight, and it's affecting our everyday lives without us even knowing. And it's not just what you read on your Facebook feed or what you watch on Netflix, but what you eat. It affects what you eat, how you get around, and on and on. So that was the origin.
And before you even started, you had to figure out what actually counts as AI. So a lot of us will think, oh, ChatGPT or image generators, but you also included things like apps that predict traffic or filter spam. So how did you decide what made the cut and what didn't?
Yeah, most of the experts I talked to said AI is an umbrella term. So it covers ChatGPT, which gets all the attention. It's the new kid on the block. But it also covers something that's been around for a couple of decades called machine learning. And machine learning is how Netflix recommends movies to you. It's how Facebook adjusts your feed. And it's basically a program that evolves and learns. I think of it as a recipe where instead of the ingredients staying the same, if the recipe senses, oh, people like sugar, let's add some more sugar. And that turns out to be everywhere. It's in Con Edison uses machine learning to figure out how to allot the energy. The reservoirs, New York reservoir system uses machine learning to help predict where there's going to be demand. Now, they did want to make clear, engineers make the final decisions because they didn't want people to freak out. But they do use machine learning to help, as does so many other things in our lives.
But with that Con Ed example, did you have to live without electricity or cooking or things like that?
I did. I commit to the bit, as you know, Brian. So
Yes.
I went full Amish, and I had a solar powered generator, so I was able to use that for a while. But I ended up writing the article by candlelight on a typewriter because, of course, my laptop is filled with AI and machine learning. The battery optimizer alone is machine learning. So yeah, it was a time travel experience.
And we can talk a little bit about what you were wearing. Yours was an outfit from the 1970s, inherited from your grandfather. Describe it and why that?
Yes, I did end up looking absurd and do some absurd things, which is part of the process. But yeah, I looked like Austin Powers. I had on red and white checkered pants. I had on this flowered shirt. And that was because modern clothes are touched by AI. They may not be totally generated by AI, but they are certainly marketed using AI. A lot of designers are using AI for inspiration, and anything that is shipped on the supply chain is really affected by AI because machine learning figures out what is the most efficient way to ship things. So really, I said, I got to get away from modern clothes, and I went deep in my closet, and this was what I found.
What's the moral underpinning of this experiment? Like, I know we're all concerned about AI taking jobs and AI sucking so much electricity that is pushing a lot of people's energy rates up, other things as well. But it also helps us in many ways, some of these little ways that you're pointing out, from weather forecast to whatever. So what was the moral point you were trying to prove?
I love that question. And as you say, I was not saying AI is all bad or all good. I think it's both. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. As you say, I mean, it's great that AI is figuring out new medicines. I have no problem with it making our water system more efficient, so it's cheaper. But I think that we need to realize AI is already here. That was one of the big points, that to realize how omnipresent AI is, and that it's just going to get more intertwined with art. So we need to A, be aware. B, I want more transparency. When I get an email, I want to know, was this by ChatGPT? And I also want us to think more about regulations. There's California is considering a regulation where every image that's AI has to be watermarked. So you can see, oh, that's AI. I love that. And I'm also concerned about privacy. Like facial recognition, which uses AI, is so much more common than I thought. It was quite alarming. I ended up wearing these anti-facial recognition glasses.
I forgot to mention that about your outfit.
Yeah, it's quite a look.
Anti-facial recognition sunglasses. There's such a thing. I didn't know.
Yeah, there are privacy advocates out there who are very concerned and trying to fight back. So I did look like, people said I looked like Elton John. They were white and big, and they looked a little ridiculous. But yeah, as you say, it's not good or bad, but let's be aware of it and be intentional in how we use it and regulate it.
I think Bess in the Bronx has an AI pet peeve. Bess,
I love it.
WNYC with AJ Jacobs. Hi, Bess.
How do you get away with getting a robotic person to make your appointment at the doctor's office? It drives me crazy. More and more of my doctors are doing this, the AI person. And what's really, really funny about it is that they have a background noise of other people talking. So it makes people feel that they're in an office, in quotes.
Tricky.
So it's very tricky. Yeah.
We know we're in a new age when people are nostalgic for call centers.
Good line, Brian. Well, it is amazing. There's also reports of people who have to do job interviews with robots. And so, yes, as part of this, first of all, I had to use a landline because that uses less AI than Verizon wireless. But I also tried to speak to actual humans, And it was a challenge when I tried to call eBay for customer service. They just flat out refused to connect me to a human. And I think, as you say, that is a big problem. It does make their lives more efficient, but a lot of times we're sort of in between the cracks. We have something that cannot fall into one of the buckets. And I feel that with AI, we're not getting that addressed.
Few more minutes with A.J. Jacobs on his 48 hours trying to live without artificial intelligence. Listener texts, Jacobs' experiment reminds me of Colin Bevins living for a year in New York City with the smallest environmental impact. The documentary No Impact Man was made about him, and he was on the show for that. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This goes back to around 2009. And I actually, to support him, we were broadcasting at that time from the 24th floor of the Manhattan Municipal Building. And just to show a little solidarity, I met him in the lobby of the building and walked up with him the 24 flights to the studio.
Wow.
Because he wouldn't take the elevator. And it was very instructive to me. I thought, okay, I'm leaving about 45 minutes for this. And it took like 8 minutes, So it just, it taught me something about how much we depend on technology that may impact the environment when we don't have to. But what do you think about that analogy?
I think it's a great analogy. I know Colin. I actually blurbed his book, so I'm a fan. And I think it's a great point. Because electricity is driven by AI, or AI helps it, that I couldn't use it. So again, I was doing the same thing. And also, speaking of elevators, a lot of office elevators now are AI driven in that they figure out what's the best floor to hang out on. Because if maybe it's the middle floor. And again, I have no problem with that. That might make my life a tiny bit better. It might save me 3 seconds in an elevator. But it also has AI has these unintended consequences that we have to be aware of. But yeah, I did not ride an elevator or, as I say, use my computer or iPhone. No, I couldn't listen to podcasts. Now, I don't know.
What?
Yeah, I don't know
that's going too far. I'm kidding.
It is. I don't recommend that as a podcaster myself. But a lot of podcasts use AI in all sorts of ways. The research, the edit. I'm no accusations, Brian, and no judgments, Brian, if you do. But in the editing, they take out the ums and the uhs from the guests. Of course, you're live, so I can and all I want.
And we have podcasts too, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I'll listen to the podcast and see if I'm cleaned up. But yeah, and in terms of mixing, so AI in entertainment is everywhere as well.
But I didn't know that AI could do that. Clean up the uhs and the ahs on purpose. I mean, on the rare occasion that we would do that because it was, overwhelmingly distracting or something like that in one, particular case. We certainly wouldn't do it throughout a conversation, but maybe there was just an embarrassing moment for a guest or something like that, and we take out one little spot. We have human engineers who do that. I didn't know AI could spot those.
Yes, but some people say that's not very good at it. So please keep your engineers on. I don't want to cause any trouble.
And I should note, because this may be the most extreme of all the things you had to do, by the end of day one, you're out in Central Park foraging for dinner. I'm guessing that's not your usual dinner plan. What did you actually end up eating?
Well, that was certainly, as you say, an extreme part. And I felt I could not eat grocery bought food because industrial farms use machine learning and AI in figuring out how to irrigate and how to ship. So I thought, well, to be really safe, I should forage in Central Park, where there's as little AI as possible. And you probably had this guy, Wildman Steve Brill, on the show.
Right,
yeah.
Right. He gives tours to show people what a lot of the plants and stuff are in the city.
Exactly. So I took some of his advice and I went foraging for what are they called? Plantain weeds. So I had some of those. I couldn't cook them, so I had them raw. Do not recommend them. Do not recommend them. But it did keep me somewhat fed.
And I'm cringing at the thought of interaction that those weeds may have had with some New York City critters, but I will leave that there. One more call.
You.
Tara in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hey, Tara, we have about 30 seconds for you.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. What I called about was to see the guests and yours, Brian, thoughts on Local Law 35, which requires New York City agencies to report what algorithmic tools they use and how many. And if you look in the, I think, 5 years that law has existed, the vast majority of the agencies still report 0, which is obviously not true. I think DOT last year reported 1. An agency that controls, thousands and thousands of miles of streets, of intersections, use tons of softwares. And I'm curious how we might, what you all think about it and how we might ask even our local government to enforce
Follow
that
their
more.
own law. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tara,
Thank you.
Candidly, you're telling me something that I didn't know. And so that certainly fits in to the beat of the show. And we're going to check out Local Law 35 and maybe do a segment on it. AJ, like 15 seconds for a last answer. We'll see if that's, exactly how she described and all of that. But
those
a
are
last
some big
thought.
issues for 15 seconds. But yes, I agree. More transparency. Government, I went online and found a lot of examples of algorithms and AI they were using, but more. We need to know where AI is so that we can figure out whether it's affecting us in a good or bad way so we can regulate it.
A.J. Jacobs' latest book is The Year of Living Constitutionally. His article in the New York Times that we've been discussing is called 48 Hours Without AI. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Brian.
The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now the journalist and climate activist Bill McKibben. This fall, the climate journalist group covering Climate Now gave McKibben their first ever Lifetime Achievement Award. He also has a new book about solar energy called Here Comes the Sun. Some of you know Bill McKibben's work and may know he's been a New Yorker staff writer. He's written influential books, beginning with The End of Nature in 1989, that has been credited with helping launch the modern climate movement. He's been at Middlebury College in Vermont for around 25 years, holding the title of Distinguished Scholar. He founded the climate activism groups 350.org and a more recent one called Third Act for seniors who want to be involved in the climate movement. In giving McKibben their Lifetime Achievement Award, Covering Climate Now says they also, quote, hope to prompt a re-examination of the role of advocacy in journalism at this pivotal moment in American history, unquote. And with all of that as prelude, Bill McKibben, thanks for joining us today and welcome back to WNYC.
To be with you as always, friend.
Can I jump right in on that question of advocacy in journalism? How much do you consider yourself an advocate? How much do you see yourself as a journalist? And do you ever experience a conflict or a tension between those two roles?
Well, I couldn't go be the kind of beat journalist covering climate change at the New York Times, I guess, because I have a clear interest, I have clear hope in the outcome here. I really want us not to overheat the planet. And truthfully, that's been the case back since I wrote The End of Nature in my 20s, back in the 1980s. Halfway through that book, it was clear to me that I wasn't objective in the sense that I cared about the outcome. But I was as objective as I've always been in my life as a journalist in telling the truth. And I've continued to do that in an awful lot of different places. Someone told me the other day that I'd written more words about climate change than anybody else in the history of the English language anyway. If that's true, given the temperature of the planet, I may be the least successful writer of all time. But I do think I've stayed true to my calling of trying to tell people what the heck is going on.
And your answer does raise the question or the thought that being objective is not necessarily the same as being neutral. You can be looking at something objectively and, based on the evidence, come to a conclusion, which is part of what you're saying. But it does raise a question of trust for some people. Pure journalism, like pure science, will always cite the uncertainties and shades of gray, right? And the best arguments against drawing a particular conclusion where there are competing interests or complexities. Do you feel like you've done that in your own
I've
writing
done my
about climate
best.
change?
I've done my best. This new book of mine does its best to kind of raise and answer each of the questions about solar energy as they appear. And I think it's pretty successful in that regard. But yeah, you have to, it's not good journalism if you're not acknowledging what's going on. Because those are the questions that rise in readers' minds, you know. And if you don't answer them, if you don't address them, then people won't be able to trust what you're doing.
All right, let's talk about some of the work of your life in the context of this Advocacy Journalism Lifetime Achievement Award from Covering Climate Now. And let's start at the beginning. For the various times you've been on the show, I don't think I've ever asked you, where did you grow up and how did you first get interested in science or journalism or politics?
Well, I grew up mostly in the suburbs of Boston, and my father was a newspaper man. So by the age of 13 or 14, I was making money writing for newspapers. Not very much money. I covered high school sports for 25 cents a column inch, which may explain why I started writing long at some point, I guess. Um, by the time I got out of college, since I'd worked on the newspaper around the clock while I was in school, I didn't have many other things I knew how to do. So happily, the New Yorker asked me to come to write the Talk of the Town column in the early 1980s under William Shawn. And so when I was 21, that's where I ended up and spent the next 5 years very happily doing that. But while I was in New York doing that and living at the corner of Bleecker and Broadway in a sublet apartment, I wrote a long piece about where everything in my apartment came from. I followed I was down in Brazil because Con Ed was getting oil from there, and I was up in the Arctic because they were buying electric power from the James Bay, Hudson Bay dams, and I was in the Grand Canyon because they were getting uranium for Indian Point from there, and I was out with the garbage barges and along the, magnificent New York City water supply system, and on and on. And that was a long piece in the New Yorker. But in the course of doing it, I think what I really realized in a way that I hadn't before was the physicalness of the world that we live in. I grew up in a suburb of Boston, which is, a suburb is a kind of way for hiding the workings of the machinery around you. Where does the water come from? Who knows? It comes from the tap. By the time I was done that piece, I realized that even a place like Manhattan, that seems like it can mint money out of thin air, is exquisitely dependent on the continued safe operation of the planet's physical systems. And I think that set me up for reading the earliest climate science that was just starting to come out in the journals in those days. I think I took it a lot more seriously than I might otherwise have done, understanding to some degree the fragility of our arrangements. And so that's why when I was 28, I published this book, The End of Nature, that was the first chronicle of what we now call the climate crisis. Back then, we still called it the greenhouse effect. Ever since, this is the work I've been engaged in because it's the most interesting intellectual problem there's ever been, and because it's the deepest, most dangerous cul-de-sac into which our species has ever wandered.
If I had to guess, Which department of the New Yorker did Bill McKibben start at? I never would have guessed talk of the town.
Well, and you wouldn't have been able to guess because back in those days it was all anonymous.
Right.
And so it was. I had a great fun exploring New York City, but I would have guessed back then that I would have ended up spending my life writing about sort of urban issues. I lived for a while on the streets as a homeless person because Mr. Sean wanted to understand what then seemed like novel a novel emergency. Homelessness on the streets of New York City was before we just decided it was going to be a regular part of the urban fabric, sadly. Um, um, but but the story of climate change became so compelling to me that I've stuck with it.
When did you start the activist group 350.org, and remind people what the number 350 represents?
It represents the amount of carbon we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number we were already past by that point, and now we're at 425 parts per million, which is why, Los Angeles catches on fire and the poles melt and so on. I started it in about 2008. I'd spent the better part of 2 decades after publishing The End of Nature, writing more books on the theory that if we won the argument, then our leaders would do what was necessary because why wouldn't they? I think journalists and academics tend to prize argument above all. But at a certain point, it became clear to me that you could win the argument and still lose the fight because the fight was less about data and reason and evidence than it was about money and power. And of course, we still see extraordinary evidence of that. We had the President of the United States engaging in crazy climate denial from from the podium of the United Nations the day before yesterday. This is a guy who told the fossil fuel industry that if they gave him $1 billion during his last campaign, he would do whatever they wanted. And indeed, he is doing whatever they want, including lie like that. I I will say that I am one of the reasons this award makes me so happy is just because covering climate now has done a great job of helping support and rally climate journalists around the world. And nobody is more grateful than me for that. There was a 10 or 15-year period when I felt very, very lonely as a climate journalist and writer. I felt like one of those people who's having one of those bad dreams where you can see a monster coming, but you can't get anybody to pay attention to you. Um, and so I have been so grateful over the last 10 years for there's been just a great surge in wonderful climate journalism. The Times now and the Post and lots and lots and lots of places are doing really good reporting. And nobody is more grateful than me for that.
And some of the other recognition you've gotten over time, especially for listeners who don't know your work, just to put you in context, have included Foreign Policy magazine naming you one of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. That was in 2009. In 2010, the Boston Globe called you probably the nation's leading environmentalist, and on from there. Your new book is Here Comes the Sun. Why focus on solar in particular at this time?
Well, because actually, this is one of these cases where I've sort of got a scoop. Uh, uh, when I published a cut of this book in the New Yorker earlier this summer, the thing I heard from everybody, and these were mostly people in the climate and energy world, was I had no idea. And what they had no idea about was the fact that over the last 36 months, solar energy and wind energy have suddenly surged. This stuff that we've been calling alternative energy for decades is alternative no longer. 95% of new generating capacity around the world last year came from sun and wind and batteries. the Chinese in May of this year were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar power a day. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant. So they were putting up one of those worth of solar panels every 8 hours. The world's getting a third more energy from the sun right now than it was this time last year. So this sudden surge in a world where most of the things that are happening right now are very big and very bad, this is the one big good thing, maybe big enough to take a bite out of both the climate crisis and maybe even the authoritarianism crisis a little as well. Because, of course, it's one of the things that gives oligarchs power is that we rely on fossil fuel, which is only available in a few places, and the people who control them end up with extraordinary power.
I want to tell you a little anecdote that the listeners might find interesting as well, because China, as you just mentioned, as well as California, play important roles in your book. And I was only in China one time. It was on a tour for journalists in 2012, led by a group that was critical of Chinese authoritarianism, but also wanted to improve understanding kind of people to people. And one of the things they took us to was a gigantic solar panel factory or farm. I still have a photo I took of solar panels as far as the eye could see. And they said at that time, 13 years ago, that China was very interested in developing solar energy as far as they could take it. And yet the U.S. criticizes China for being exempt from the Paris Climate Treaty Accord, some of the provisions, because it's also seen as a developing country. And China, despite what you said about solar, is also very big into coal, and they lead the world, along with the U.S., in greenhouse gas emissions. So how does this all compute?
Well, I mean, what's happening right now in China is a sea change like we've never seen before. Having built a lot of coal-fired power to run their industrial might over the last 2 decades, though one must add, in per capita terms, they've never really gotten close to the US in how much carbon they produce. The Chinese are now, over the last 3 or 4 years, quickly transforming themselves into not a petrostate, but the world's first electrostate. They've built something like 75% of the clean energy in the world over the last few years. Their emissions are now falling as of this year, even as ours are rising. And they're not only dominating, they're not only putting up a lot of solar panels and wind turbines, they're beginning to dominate all the technologies that will take advantage of that flood of clean energy. So, for instance, you and I, because of our vintage, are used to thinking of Detroit as the center of the world's automotive industry. But that's not true. There's a couple of cities in China whose names I find it hard to pronounce that are now more important than Detroit. They're producing better, cheaper, and more automobiles. And those are the things that are selling across the developing world. Any place where China has good trade routes, we're all of a sudden seeing not only solar panels, but EVs, e-bikes, heat pumps, all the things that go with that flood of clean electricity. And as an American, I got to say, I find this aggravating as can be, because these are American inventions. I mean, the first full solar cell in 1954, Bell Labs, Edison, New Jersey, first commercial wind turbine in the world, 30 miles south of my house in Vermont along the spine of the Green Mountains, 1943. But we're just turning these technologies over to the Chinese while we prop up we try to squeeze the last bit of profit out of 19th and 18th century technologies, coal, gas, oil. We just put a new subsidy in the president's big, beautiful bill, a new subsidy for coal, something that human beings have been using since about 1725. If we haven't figured out how to do it by now, the thought that another subsidy is going to help is absurd. Clearly, these are just the payoffs you get when you hand over enough campaign cash.
All right, so I'm going to cite a critical review of your book, because we engage in these kinds of discussions here, by the writer Ted Nordhaus, who you may know as a critic of many tenets of mainstream environmentalism. His review is called How Bill McKibben Lost the Plot. And two of his critiques are that compared to gas or coal or nuclear, which can produce energy around the clock, wind and solar depend on the weather at any given time and are therefore unreliable, and that even with battery storage of solar energy, the batteries can only hold so much. So he writes, with 30% of California's total electricity generation now coming from solar, and he gives you credit for the accuracy of that stat, the state is already frequently forced to curtail solar generation, undermining its economic viability unless it receives continuing subsidies. How would you respond to that?
Well, in the first place, California is just installing more batteries all the time. And now at night this summer on the California grid, the biggest source of supply when the sun goes down has usually been those batteries that didn't exist 3 years ago. Batteries have fallen in price just as fast as solar panels. But if you really want to see this at work, forget California and move your gaze a little ways east towards the state of Texas, which is the biggest now producer of clean energy in America. And we just had 2 days ago the head of Texas's grid regulator, it's what's called the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT. And he said, we got through the summer of 2025 despite very high heat without any of the blackouts that we've ever had to worry about in the past, because we now have so many solar panels and batteries and they stabilize as opposed to destabilizing the system. When you have, coal-fired, gas-fired power plants, they go out of service a lot. But the sun is, so far, come up every morning. We're talking about a new world of energy. And of course, the people who profit from the old world of energy are going to be resistant to the change. That's why what's happening in China is so interesting. And I think what we'll look back on I think American historians will look back on the last 8 months as a kind of rise of whatever we're calling this kind of off-brand fascism that we're seeing. But I think world historians will see it as the 8 months in which America ceded a kind of economic and technological primacy, and perhaps with it a kind of political leadership from the West to China.
And of course, a lot of people will debate the word fascism, just acknowledging, but I hear what you're saying. And Bob in Highland Park, you're on WNYC with Bill McKibben as he gets the Covering Climate Now journalism and activist group Lifetime Achievement Award and publishes his new book, Here Comes the Sun. Hi, Bob.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for taking my call. Earlier in the discussion, he mentioned that he used to report on this when it was called the greenhouse effect. And I wonder if we haven't lost something in terms of the discussion by using that simpler term more that the public at large could probably grasp better than climate change, even though climate change is a much more encompassing term.
Bob, thank you. Actually, greenhouse effect, global warming is another one, or climate change that people tend to use as meaning the same thing. Is there one you prefer?
Well, truthfully, I think the caller has a good point. The greenhouse effect was a good name because it described accurately what's happening here, that we're by putting this blanket of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and a few smaller ones into the atmosphere, we're in essence putting a blanket around the planet and heating it up. People started calling it global warming or climate change. Truthfully, I think the most accurate term now is the one that a number of periodicals started using a few years ago when people just started referring to it as the climate crisis. I think that probably at this point most accurately captures where we are. But I do miss the greenhouse effect because it helps people just grasp the science quite easily and quickly.
On climate crisis, that same writer, Ted Nordhaus, also wrote an article arguing that climate catastrophism, as he sees it, based on recent events, is being way overplayed. So he writes, for example, the list of the worst climate-related disasters in U.S. history, those that claimed 1,000 or more American lives, is dominated by events that occurred before 1940. There were hurricanes in 1893, 1893 again, 1899, 1900, and 1928, heat waves in 1896 and 1936, floods in 1862 and 1889, and wildfires in 1871 and 1918. That he sees as, I guess, taking more lives. I don't have that stat in front of me.
Yes.
But he writes, by contrast, since 1940, only 3 climate disasters have claimed 1,000 or more lives. So I guess that's the metric there. A heat wave in 1980, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and Hurricane Maria in 2017. How do you respond to that?
Well, think about what a hurricane was like in 1899, Brian. It pounced on you entirely unaware. And so you had, until a few hours before, no idea what was about to descend on your crazily flimsy housing wherever you were along Galveston Bay at the time. Now, what happens if there's a hurricane coming? 8 days out, CNN is running pictures of the cone of uncertainty, and federal officials, well, at least before we got rid of FEMA, were, are helping figure out who's going to evacuate where and so on and so forth. This is the kind of unscientific stuff that climate denialists of one kind or one flavor or another love to engage in. But obviously, as any hurricane scientist will tell you, we've now created the conditions for larger and more rapidly intensifying hurricanes than we have ever seen before. And that's because hurricanes draw their power from the hot water in the first few meters of the sea's surface. There's more of that now. It goes down deeper, and so there's a bigger heat engine. Thank heaven we have the satellites and sensors and things that allow us at least to see them coming so we don't die in them. But if you have any doubts about whether or not they're for real, you could ask the insurance industry, which has been basically refusing to underwrite millions upon millions of Americans in the hurricane zones of the Gulf, in the flood zones of the Appalachians, in the fire zones of California. These are the guys we ask to analyze risk in our economy, and they're telling us this is real. I don't think you could find a scientist who would tell you that climate change isn't real, but you can find a president who will tell you that, and that is a real problem.
David in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC with Bill McKibben. Hi, David.
Hey, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Bill. I'm one of your students from Bard College, 1988, the Bard Summer Times. Thank you for planting the seed back then of environmental justice. I think you will also recall I was with you at the final day of the arrest against the Keystone Pipeline, along with my comrades from Casa Pueblo in Puerto Rico, who were also fighting a pipeline then. And we fought Keystone, and we fought the Via Verde project in Puerto Rico. We were successful on both fronts. So I wanted to give you your props on those things, and always ask you to keep Puerto Rico in your mind and in your thoughts and in your words, because it's often forgotten in the conversation about climate catastrophe and climate change. And we just commemorated the 8th year after Maria, and we've got a privatized distribution and energy generation crisis in Puerto Rico. The governor, who's a MAGA, also signed a deal worth some $2 or $3 billion with New Fortress Energy, and we need to continue to fight for climate justice in Puerto Rico. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. We did this big Sunday event around the country, 500 events celebrating renewable energy. One of the things that we released was a beautiful documentary movie, about half an hour long, called The Light Won't Dim. And it begins with a really beautiful section on what's happening in Puerto Rico, where many, many, many people are now turning to solar power, in part because they saw what happened after Maria and how slow the government was to respond and try to get electricity back up and things. So now more and more and more people are taking this into their own hands, which is a good reminder, by the way, that though the president is, for his own selfish reasons, against renewable energy. It's by no means clear that that's true for conservatives around the country. In fact, since I've lived much of my life in rural America, some of it red state, some of it blue, I have lots of Trumpy neighbors along the dirt roads where I live, and an awful lot of them have solar panels, often less because they're concerned about the climate crisis, and more on the grounds that my home is my castle, and it's a better castle when it has an independent power supply. I don't think it's impossible that we can make real inroads here, even with the Trump administration trying to get in the way. We're going to keep pushing. It's one of the things that at Third Act, this group that we organize among older Americans, people over the age of 60, that we're really focused on, trying to make it much easier for Americans to get the cheap solar power that's easy to come by in Australia or the EU, but that's much more expensive than it needs to be in the U.S.
AJ in La Mesa, California. You're on WNYC. Hello, AJ.
Hello, Professor McKibben. First, congrats on the award. Second, wanted to ask you about distributed capacity and its benefits over remote generations. For example, in New York State, Governor Hochul is planning to build another nuclear-efficient power plant up on the St. Lawrence River. In California, back in the day, Governor Schwarzenegger spoke about 1 million solar roofs, and I would posit that having distributed capacity and siting it locally rather than afar has numerous benefits. For one thing, if you utilize local incident solar radiation to create capacity, you will decrease the urban heat island effect, which can be substantial. Plus, you have far lower line losses and improved reliability. I'll take your comments off the air. Thanks very much.
AJ, thank you. And I'll note for the listeners that California plays a very significant role in your book, so you can even go beyond a specific question and talk a little bit about that.
Well, his specific question is just fascinating because it exemplifies the kind of new energy world that we're moving into. California did a test this summer of what they're calling virtual power plant. And what that virtual power plant consisted of was about 100,000 batteries in the basements of Californians who have solar panels on the roof. But these are networked together into the grid. So at times of peak demand, if people give permission, the utility can call on those batteries to meet that need without having to turn on expensive fossil fuel generation capacity. In Vermont, where I live now, the virtual power plant of batteries in people's basements is the single biggest power plant in the state. So we are moving from this world of, where energy comes from a few big centralized plants into a world where it's distributed in many of the ways that the caller's describing. For that to be easier, we have to make it more and more possible, not just to build solar farms and transmission lines, but also for people to do this on their own roofs and balconies. And I'll give you two examples. We have Americans pay 3 times as much for solar power as Australians or Europeans. That's mostly because of the excess bureaucracy here. Every municipality has its own building code, and we can get around that easily with this thing called the Solar App Plus that the federal government put out a couple of years ago, and that California and Maryland and the New Jersey legislature, though I don't think the New Jersey governor has yet signed off on it, have adopted. It basically allows a contractor to get an instant permit just by plugging in the equipment that he's using and the address where he's going to use it. And it's the kind of thing that makes it so much cheaper other places. For New Yorkers, many of whom lack their own roof, we also have this thing called balcony solar that has swept Europe in the last few years. Millions and millions and millions of apartment dwellers This is so simple. You just go to, whatever the equivalent of Best Buy in Brussels is, and you come home with a panel that you hang over the railing of your apartment balcony and plug directly into the wall. No electrician needed. Often it'll provide a fifth of the power. That's illegal everywhere in America, except in the state of Utah, where the legislature allowed it earlier this year, and now there's many videos on YouTube of happy Utahns doing this. I think that New York Assemblywoman Emily Gallagher may be introducing a law like that in Albany sometime in the next few days. And if it passes, then New Yorkers, many of whom are apartment dwellers, obviously, will be able to take part in the solar revolution themselves.
We get one more in here for you. Aisha in Harlem, you're on WNYC. Hello, Aisha.
Hello, it's so lovely to hear this conversation, and I'm very inspired by everything you're sharing. And I just wanted to quickly talk about some global crises that I feel like are affecting New York. My family are climate refugees coming from Pakistan. I know many diasporas across the globe that have, had to flee due to constant climate injustices happening. And so I kind of wanted to get more insight as I'm connecting more here at the Javits Center with communities of climate anthropologists and scientists about what you feel like our organizing capacity can be as people in the global north and as people who are the heavier contributors for a lot of these climate catastrophes that are affecting the global south, including people like communities we might come from. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to bridge something in to kind of show the relevancy is that I have worked with a lot of farmers here on the ground. And I know that in India since 1995, according to The Guardian, more than 300,000 farmers and farm workers have, committed suicide because of the crop production failure. And it's estimated that by 2050, according to the World Bank, there's going to be near zero crop production in Pakistan, which is going to cause catastrophic effects for, I would say, all of the other nations. And as we're seeing the responses to these refugees and other people coming in that we might see as alien, I just wanted to kind of get your insight on how the youth, because I am part of the younger generation, how we can continue to organize in an effective way that is also aware of
this global view is a great way to end. And Bill, we have about 45 seconds.
I'll just end by saying it lets us end on a piece of good news, because she's absolutely right about the global injustice here. In Pakistan, where she comes from, farmers in the last year have been one of the biggest adopters of solar power on the planet. There's cheap Chinese solar panels available, and they're using them to replace the expensive diesel to run irrigation pumps. Often they lack the money to build the metal stands that we've seen. They just lay the solar panels on the ground and point them at the sun. Pakistani farmers used 35% less diesel last year than they'd used the year before. It's not America leading the train here. America is the caboose, and we're trying to put the brake on. It's precisely people like Pakistani farmers that are showing us a graceful way forward.
Bill McKibben, recipient now of the Climate Journalism and Advocacy Journalism Group Covering Climate Now Lifetime Achievement Award, and he has a new book, Here Comes the Sun. Bill, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, friend. Have a good day.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. More to come. It's a Best of Brian Lehrer show on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So who at some point or another has wanted to be more outgoing than you are, more generous than you are, maybe a little less neurotic, however you define that? Changing these aspects can feel insurmountable, right? It's just who you are. But in her new book, Olga Hazan, staff writer at The Atlantic, went on a year-long quest to fine-tune her personality, or at least to try. Turns out she discovered there are 5 key traits that are on a sliding scale, and they're measurable. Through her research, she discovered that you can alter these traits, yes you can, by consistently behaving in ways that align with the kind of person you'd like to be. This new book is called Me But Better, The Science and Promise of personality change. Hi, Olga. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
And I'm just going to list these 5 factors so listeners know what they are that you say personality consists of scientifically: extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness, and neuroticism. Do you want to talk about any one of those as an example of how you think they can be measured?
Yeah, so extroversion is one that might resonate with people. I think we all know what an extrovert is versus an introvert. And for me, I really wanted to increase my levels of extroversion because really even acting in an extroverted way occasionally can actually make you happier. So when I took this science-based personality test, it showed me that my levels of extroversion were very, very low. And so by kind of pushing myself to get out there more, interact more with other people, and do more activities, I was actually able to increase my levels of extroversion.
And we should say you embarked on this years-long project to fine-tune your personality, and you used a free questionnaire to periodically assess your progress. So you want to tell us briefly about the questionnaire? This isn't the Myers-Briggs test that a lot of listeners might be familiar with, right?
No, it's not. It's not the Myers-Briggs. It's actually a different type of test. It's called the 5-factor personality test. And I actually used a website called personalityassessor.com that was designed by a professor of psychology. And so these are just tests that measure where you fall on these 5 factors of personality. So it'll ask you questions like whether you enjoy parties, whether you enjoy poetry, and based on your responses to these, it'll tell you kind of where you fall along each of these 5 factors.
And you write in the book, each trait has different benefits, but some of the benefits are surprisingly substantial, accounting for a large percentage of life satisfaction, professional success, and even longevity. And you use conscientiousness, one of those 5 variables, as a case in point in your book. So you want to walk us through that one and how significant you think it may be to any of those happiness measures?
Yeah, so conscientiousness is a good example of how changing your personality can actually make you happier and healthier. Conscientious people do tend to be healthy because conscientiousness involves, eating right, exercising, sort of not overindulging, being, productive, being organized, making time to cook and things like that. Of course, none of us can be like this all the time, but the people who tend to do it more tend to be healthier. And so, conscientiousness can actually increase your longevity. It also really has an impact on work. You can get more done at work. You can get a big raise or a promotion if you're very conscientious. So that's a trait that's a good example of why you would want to change your personality.
And on extroversion, you write that studies show that extroverts are happier, and I know some introverts out there listening are going to disagree with that and say, look, I'm perfectly fine, only interacting as much as I want or need to interact. But what's this correlation that you found between how, and you might want to define extroversion because it's not always what people think it is, between how many friends, or it's really how much interaction you want to have, right?
Yeah, so extroversion, the connection between extroversion and happiness really comes down to social connection, because social connection is really one of those things that fuels our happiness, right? We're social creatures. Even if we're super introverted, we need people in our lives who support us and understand us. And if you are super introverted and not interested in, being really outgoing or being the life of the party, one thing you could do is just spend more time around people, but not necessarily be talking that whole time. You could just listen more than you talk. You could participate in like a group volunteer effort or something that doesn't involve a ton of conversation, but is still a social kind of outing. That still counts as extroversion.
Matt on Staten Island, you're on WNYC. Hi, Matt.
Hi. I just wanted to say I've tried to change my behaviors to be more extroverted over the years, and it didn't really work. And then I found out I had a condition called Asperger's, which greatly impacts your kind of social abilities. And I found that after I started talking to other people with the same condition, it was more enjoyable to be social. And I guess for an example, there was one person who was just kind of talking my ear off, and I just got to sort of stare at my dinner plate. And that was actually very pleasant, whereas typically I would usually feel very awkward and just, couldn't wait to get away.
Because they were letting you be who you are? Is that one way to put it?
Yeah, I suppose so. The healthy behaviors of an extrovert, I feel, are almost impossible for someone like me. So it was nice to just get to, not have to do the eye contact and all that kind of thing. And in some ways, I feel more extroverted while still being, an introvert.
Matt, thank you very much. Here's another one, maybe somewhat related. Garfield in Hackensack. You're on WNYC. Hello, Garfield.
Hello. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, it is somewhat related. I'm an instructor, and I'm usually very introverted. But in order to make money, I have to teach. And beyond learning the material and being able to learn it well enough to teach, the fact of getting up in front of people on a regular basis who are new each time allows me to explore different sides of myself when I know the material enough to actually start to express myself in an introverted way. So I just want to say that it's lucky if someone who's introverted finds a job or a vocation where they get to express themselves. They're kind of forced into it, and they actually start maybe enjoying it and finding freedom in doing that kind of work.
Garfield, thank you so much for that story. And it kind of goes to an underlying thing that I think is in your book, Olga. And you kind of referred to it early in the segment. But you wrote about the common phrase, fake it till you make it. And it seems like what you were saying at the beginning, correct me if I misinterpreted you, is that you start to act like the person you want to be on these 5 personality trait measures. You start to act more extroverted even if you don't feel it. You start to act more conscientious even if you don't feel you would have done that spontaneously, more agreeable, more open, and you just kind of intentionally start to do those things, and then theoretically they start to become more of who you actually are. Is that the essence of your book?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when you first start doing any of these things, if you're a hardened introvert and you start leading a group at work, it's going to feel really unnatural and uncomfortable. But after you do it enough, as the previous caller mentioned, you're going to start to get better and better at it. And you might even start to enjoy it a little bit. And then having that experience of doing that, over and over again, it'll actually kind of become part of your personality. You'll start to see yourself that way as someone who is maybe even a little bit extroverted naturally.
Let's take another call with another kind of story, I think. Alessandro in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Alessandro.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for taking the call. And as they say to Brian in New York City, you're the treasure of the city. Thank you so much for all your work you've done. Love the work you do, man.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say how for years I actually worked in academia. And I also even worked in sales in the past before that. And that requires more of an extroverted personality and somebody who's really open and constantly wants to discuss and write. However, I really needed to change my life, hated staring at the screen, and so I became a carpenter. But to become a carpenter from that kind of world, not only do I have to change my physical body, to doing something that I always loved doing in carpentry, but my mindset. I needed to change from being those kinds of qualities to being more meticulous and, like you said, kind of neurotic and more quiet. And I needed to learn a lot more. And I need to approach how I talk to people differently as well. And my past experience has definitely helped with what I'm doing now. But now that I tapped into this different type of self, it really, really helped me grow as a person.
It's such an interesting change from academia to carpenter. Olga, since you wrote the book on this topic, is there anything you as a journalist, I'm putting you on the spot, you can say no, want to ask Alessandro?
Yeah, I'm wondering how you actually learned the tools of carpentry. Like, how were you able to get good at it? Like, what did you rely on in order to learn those new skills?
Well, there's definitely things that I grew up with, which helped me be introduced to it and really like that. But I needed to read books, of course. I needed to go online and look at every single YouTube tutorial, DIY video to really do what I'm doing. But really what changed me the most is actually just spending time with other professionals and really allowing myself to adapt to their lifestyle. Maybe not realize what's negative and don't go deep into those negatives of their personalities, but there's so much that I was able to change solely by just being around those kinds of people, without a doubt.
Alessandro, thank you very much for your story. Wow. What would you say to someone, Olga, who thinks people shouldn't be trying to change their personalities this much? They should be working more on accepting who they are and judging themselves less.
Yeah, so I think you can definitely accept who you are and not judge yourself, but see the tools of personality change as a way to grow who you are and to become even better. That's why the book is really called Me But Better, because even who I take a really critical approach toward myself in the book, I have personality traits that I like about myself. I'm very conscientious and I'm very open to experiences, and I didn't try to change those things about myself. So what I really wanted to do is to use the tools of personality change so I could get more out of life, so that I could enjoy my life more and appreciate what I have. And so I think that's sort of an act of self-love and self-acceptance.
Interestingly, it seems to be the introvert-extrovert scale that's really pushing a lot of callers' buttons. So let's hear another one about that one. Evelyn in Mendham, you're on WNYC. Hi, Evelyn.
Hey, Brian, longtime listener, sustainer, love your programming. This is a great topic of discussion. I am totally an extrovert, but my friend Robin is an introvert. We both work in fitness, and the minute she would strap on a microphone and step in front of a room full of people, she would shine like the sun. But you put her in a room, like at a party, and she would fade into the wallpaper. So I think for a lot of introverts, they need to find something that turns them on, and then they can shine when they want to. And then when they need to pull back and turn off and recharge their batteries, they can. So I think some of us kind of ride that spectrum. We're a little bit of both, but I mean, go introverts. Do your thing, shine your shine, do your thing. I love it. I think it's great.
Evelyn, thank you very much. Any thought on that, Olga?
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like she's kind of describing this concept called free traits. One of the people I interviewed for the book is actually a professor who's very introverted, but it's very important to him to be an engaging teacher and to present to his classes in a very animated and engaging way. And he does. He becomes very extroverted for that period of time that he's teaching. And that sounds very similar to what her friend is doing. That's also a form of personality change, is sort of switching up your traits depending on the situation.
And Me But Better, the title of your book, this isn't about being a people pleaser and changing your personality because other people want you to. This is about making yourself happier if you're unhappy with certain things, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I just wrote a newsletter post about this. People will probably like the new you better, but more importantly, you'll like the new you better and you'll get more out of life.
Here's an interesting question from a listener in a text asking, I'm just going to summarize it, if these 5 personality traits have been looked at as a basis for political leaning.
They have. Yeah, great question. So openness to experiences, which is one of the personality traits, high levels of that is correlated with political liberalism.
And that one in particular, any others?
No, mostly that one, because that is the one where you are sort of kind of very open to whatever. You're very kind of creative. You are okay with like new trends and new ideas. The classic thing of conservatives like standing athwart history, yelling stop. That really, people who are open to experiences do not agree with that at all.
All right. And let's see. Do we have time for one more? Well, I'll read a text because we're going to run out of time rather than take a call. Another text says, I'm wondering if striving for one trait would take away from another trait that was positive in your, quote, previous self, or maybe how to conquer a fear of that.
Yeah, so the traits don't really work that way where like one takes away from the other. So you can definitely grow any of the traits without sacrificing the ones that you're already kind of working on. And I would say to use your strengths in order to build on the things that you want to accomplish. So if you're really conscientious, use that to become, say, more extroverted.
Olga Hazanis is staff writer at The Atlantic and author of the new book, Me But Better, The Science and Promise of Personality Change. Thanks so much for coming on. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
And that's the Brian Lehrer Show for today. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for Allison.